Hello class. Now I'm offering feedback for our Stoicism work, and I'm always impressed with the work that students present for this philosophy. And I think the reason why is I always like the way that it's accessible, and I like the way that I could tell students key into it, and it's clearly understandable, right? That this is a point of reference by which we could organize our moral thinking, especially around nature. Now, the the points with the writing, I noticed uh, from a technical standpoint, really the only problem was that students were forgetting to capitalize Stoicism. So there was that. Then there's the question. There were a couple of questions having to do with question of fate, and then likewise, how is it that we are living in accordance with nature, not only for ourselves, but also in relation to other people and nature at large? Okay, so we'll sort of tackle that as encompassing how we were looking at our four questions. So let's start off though. So I want to look at this meditation, but I also want to look at this diagram that I found, which is nice. So we were referring to the Stoics as determinists or practicing a kind of determinism, all right? And so here we have a diagram on the relationship between free will and determinism. And so what we want to distinguish first, well, what's determinism? Determinism has to do with this idea that there is a set way in which the world is operating, and that set way has to do with basically the laws of nature. So the world operates according to laws of nature, strictly. So that's what's referred to in this diagram as hard determinism. Okay? And we might be mistaken to think that that's the Stoic point of view. And then likewise, within that, we might also then couple that with this notion of fate. Okay. And so with fate, we're that's slightly different than determinism in the sense that with determinism, things are the way they are because of natural laws. Okay. That's a rough deterministic definition. For fate, however, fate is this idea that something is predetermined to be what it is into the future, right? So we might even think of the word destiny there. So it's our destiny to be a certain way, and there's no way to break out of that destiny. Whereas with determinism, it's really just simply things are the way they are, even though, well, as they are determined by the laws of nature. So just very slight definition there, slight variation there with fate and determinism. Okay. Now we have what this chart is referring to as soft determinism, or otherwise known as compatibilism. And so we're basically wanting to situate Stoicism within this compatibilism category here. Okay, they're not libertarians, and this is a little to be distinguished in this case from the libertarians of in politics, by the way. So libertarianism here has to do with the idea that free will is in contrast to determinism. So libertarians reject determinism as a form of personal choice. And when we're referring to choice, which is important to distinguish for the Stoics, is responsibility, okay? Even personal responsibility, right? That in other words, a hard determinist might even be inclined to be skeptical of freedom, okay? And then likewise, freedom from what is determined or even predetermined, right? That in other words, if something is predetermined, you can't account for freedom. And if you can't account for freedom, then you can't account for responsibility either. So when we're referring to responsibility, that should be keying us into something that's rather important for ethical thinking, right? Because ethical thinking has to do with the idea that we are free to choose, and that freedom to choose has to do with uh, freedom away from a deterministic model. Okay? And so, in other words, a deterministic outlook might not even account for how it is that we're understanding things in terms of free will. Okay. So with compatibilism, we're thinking of the idea that free will and determinism are existing together. And in our example, for the Stoics. Okay. And so we're thinking of the Stoics as compatibilists. Okay, so the Stoics are compatibilist, meaning that they are accounting for free will and determinism held together. In other words, the two exist. There's no denial of that. Okay? And what we're really accounting for, as I emphasized in the feedback, is rational choice, and always understanding that that rational choice, if it's tied to freedom, then has to do with responsibility. One might call it personal responsibility or just responsibility in general, in terms of how we're understanding it as a community. So let's look at our meditation. So right off the top, so we're looking at meditation 55. We have Marcus Aurelius referring to look not to discover principles other men live by, but look instead directly at nature. So in other words, don't necessarily pay attention to how other people are living, but rather look directly at nature that surrounds you. Okay. And also your own nature. So in other words, you want to pay attention to the larger order of things, and that's important. And so that larger order of things, otherwise known as nature, would be the easiest way to think of that would be this allowance for determinism. So in other words, nature here has to do with something we would refer to as deterministic. Okay, it's following a natural order, etc. Okay, so then I have highlighted here, every being ought to do that which is according to its nature. All other things have been constituted for the sake of rational beings, just as among non-rational beings, the inferior are for the sake of the superior. Here he's being a little, he's looking down on that which is not rational. In other words, man is superior to all other beings that are um, inferior because they do not have this rational capacity. So rational capacity there is important, right? Because that's where we are agents of free will, or that's where we are agents of freedom for the Stoic. Okay. So that's what we want to really key into, because there's where we get into a question of choice. Okay. So then he wants us to look at how it is that we're paying attention to our rational nature here, right? Or we are rational beings, and we are looking at nature that surrounds us. So what do we need to do in order to learn anything from that? He lays down 3 principles. So it is man's nature in his social obligations to others of his kind. So in this sense, man we live in a community. Okay. So we live in a community of others, and in order to be virtuous, we need to pay attention to our social obligations. Okay. So then, because remember, there is this idea, look not around to discover the principles other men live by, but look instead directly at nature. okay? And so here's how we're looking at nature. And then also see this as normative. In other words, you should be doing this. So he's implying a directive here in order to understand how it is, in order to understand your rational being, look at the nature that surrounds you, and this is virtuous. This is something you should aim for. It is ethical, okay? So then the first principle then in man's nature is his social obligations, okay? And then second is not to yield to the impulses of the body, for it is particular nature of the rational intelligent being to control itself and never be overpowered by the motion of the senses or appetites, for both are animal. So in other words, control your emotions and control your appetites. That's clear. But then control itself is key there, because that's pointing us back to the free will we have in relation to our particular nature, right? That in other words, we have a particular nature, but it's within our nature even to control our animal instincts even. Okay. But that control there is key, because that's where we have personal responsibility and likewise responsibility in general, right? Responsibility toward others, etc. Okay. So the intelligent being claims superiority and does not permit itself to be overpowered by the others. And with good reason, it is formed by nature to use all of them. In other words, you are formed by nature to be reasonable enough to not be overpowered by your appetites and your emotions, is the point there, okay? Then, and that's a responsibility, okay? So key, since we're in ethics class, is how is it that we have personal responsibility for our actions by way of free will, okay? So then third principle of the rational nature is to be free from self-delusion and deception. So that one's clear, right? In other words, avoid delusion, avoid deception, but also understand that people can succumb to these, right? And so there's where question of fate is rather odd, because then fate would be you're predestined to be self-deluded, let's say. The Stoic is, or Marcus Aurelius is countering that, where you could actually counteract maybe some of these predetermined ways in which you are as a person, right? And so there's where we get that compatibilism. Okay, so that compatibilism is key, and I'm not sure if we emphasize that enough in our Zooming, so that's why I'm doing it now. Okay, so then let reason hold fast to these three principles and go straight forward, and it will fulfill its nature. So back to this normative point, again, this is implying you should do this in order to be virtuous, in order to be an excellent person, or even an excellent Stoic. You should be doing these things in order to understand your role in nature and your role in life. Okay, so I think that's good, and thank you for the excellent work, and we'll talk more later.